Clarence DeMar is a name that was associated with the Boston Marathon for years. Amanda and Alan Foles give us the background of his tie to Reading.
A sure sign of spring in eastern Massachusetts is the running of the Boston Marathon. Every Patriots' Day since 1897, runners from around the world have taken off from Hopkinton and Ashland, covering the 26 miles to Boston. For more than 100 years, the famed and fabled foot race has produced its own celebrities. During the first half of the 20th century, no runner was more famous than Clarence DeMar. From 1911 to 1930, he won the race 7 times, a record to this day. In all, he completed the course 49 times. During the last 15 years of his life and his running career, he was a Reading resident, living with his family at the DeMar farm on Forest Street. Virginia Adams and Stan Robinson give us their reflections on Clarence DeMar, Mr. Demar-athon.
We're here on Forest Street in front of Clarence DeMar's home. They moved here in town from Keene, New Hampshire. They lived here, I guess maybe 15, 20 years. And their family, they had 5 children, and unfortunately lost one while they were living here due to rheumatic fever. They were a very interesting family. Mrs. DeMar was a poetess. She was very welcoming. They both were. In fact, we kept our horses in the barn without having to pay rent or anything. It was just a community event.
My father was a great fan of the Boston Marathon. So every April we'd go in to see the race. And in those days, Clarence DeMar was beyond his prime. He was not winning the race as he had done and gotten into the record books.
He did win 7 marathons during his career, and that is a record. I should have said the Boston Marathons, and that's a record that has not yet been broken. So he was called Mr. Marathon, and quite rightly so.
People would wait for Clarence DeMar to finish the race, and then there'd be a lot of cheering and horns honking, and then the people would leave. In more recent years, they did the same thing with Johnny Kelly the Elder, that would come in toward the end of the race, and people would wait for him, and that was sort of the unofficial end of the race.
When we went into Boston to see him complete one of the marathons that he ran, this was, of course, in his later years, so we drove in. And as a kid, I was just overwhelmed thinking, that man just completed 26 miles, and anybody that's done it knows what a tremendous accomplishment that is. But we saw him finish and congratulated him, and then his wife and the children and I and my sister all drove home. But Clarence didn't come with us. He walked home, he ran home. He rarely went in the car.
I used to travel between Medford and Reading, and on several occasions I would find Clarence late at night coming home from his newspaper printing work, I believe. He'd be jogging up around Spot Pond or up through Stoneham, and I'd pick him up, give him a ride up here to Reading. He'd get off at the corner of Forest Street, and he would jog home. I suppose he would probably tell people he jogged all the way from Boston. And many a night he must have gone the whole distance, because he wasn't looking for a ride. It was only that I recognized him that I'd stop and pick him up. Otherwise, he'd shuffle along. He was getting on in years at that time too, but he did very well.
Well, every spring I usually drag out this marathon trophy. It's actually from 1930, and it was a 3rd prize. But I've let the patina go on this because it just reminds me of the DeMar family. He won this, I believe, in Canada, but after he passed away, as a family memento, his widow made sure that we had one of the many trophies. And as I say, as a kid, we used to see lots and lots of trophies on every mantle in the house.
In the 50s, our family would go over to Clarence's house to get fresh milk. He had a cow, and people went there and they would get unpasteurized milk, which was very special.
Mr. DeMar often would be out working in the fields and up in the woods, and one day I noticed he had a little fire going, and he invited us to share in a taste of squirrel meat. So that was a rather unusual childhood experience. At
Halloween time, his wife would have some of the young kids in the neighborhood come in and help make pies, and then for trick or treat, people could go into her warm kitchen and get a slice of pie. That was always kind of special.
We often shared a birthday dinner with his family, with the twin girls who were Barbara and Betty and of our age. And we'd have a dinner that featured beef that was from their farm. So they were pretty self-sufficient.
Later on in years, after Clarence had passed away, Margaret had moved into, I think, elderly housing, missed the old farm up there on Forest Street, and she wanted to have a garden, and we knew her well enough so that we had a little plot of land over at our house on Pearl Street, and she came over there and she tilled the soil, and she had quite a little garden, and we had some of her fresh vegetables. So that was my last recollection of the DeMar family.
But he was a very intellectual man, very interesting to talk to, just a very unique person, and I like to call him a man in motion.